You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is John Rubino, author of several books on the economy, including The Money Bubble. His website is dollarcollapse.com. Welcome to the show, John.
Hey, Jim. Good to talk to you.
Noticed on your website a headline saying, we're not nearly as worried about the Middle East as we should be. Why is that?
Yeah, Syria has been kind of in civil war for several years now. And, of course, Europe knows this all too well. They've got hundreds of thousands of refugees coming across their borders and asking for asylum from what has turned into a multi-front war with a whole bunch of different people trying to kill each other there. And the U.S. has been dithering, because we had no idea what to do there, as we usually don't. It's actually kind of refreshing for us to be standing back and kind of, by implication, admitting we don't know what to do. Because in the past, we've assumed we knew what to do in the Middle East, blundered in, and made a bad situation even worse over and over and over again. Going back to the CIA overthrow of Iran's democratically elected president in the 1950s, and ever since then we've destabilized countries, and we've invaded them, and we've bullied them, and we've basically turned the Middle East, single-handedly, we've turned the Middle East into this nightmare of sectarian violence and dictators and rebel groups fighting the dictators, and now it's kind of come to a head because Russia has decided that it can't take the uncertainty anymore of seeing Syria, ally of Russia's, be destabilized in this way, and now it's intervened. It's sent its Air Force and its ground troops into Syria, and they are bombing ISIS, of course, but they're also bombing some of the groups that the CIA has funded and trained. So now you've got Russia attacking U.S. surrogates in the Middle East. And China is sending troops, and Iran is sending a lot of troops. And so you've got multiple armies all fighting over the same territory right now. And you've got U.S. quasi-allies, Saudi Arabia and Iraq, not knowing which way to jump, who to fight, who to kill, who to make a deal with. And we, the U.S., are starting to look like irrelevancies. And that's where it gets dangerous, because if we just step back and let it happen, then we've basically handed the Middle East to Russia and China and Iran, which could lead to an even bigger, more destabilizing war when Israel and Saudi Arabia, who won't like that configuration of forces at all, get involved. Or everybody could just accept that that's the new balance of power there, and then Russia and China are in control of this huge oil-producing part of the world. Or the U.S. can decide it wants its old dominance back and go in and try to make it happen militarily, which would be an absolute nightmare. It would be U.S., Chinese, Iranian, and Russian soldiers fighting each other in an already destabilized part of the world. So there is no happy outcome right now in the Middle East, and you can't say anything other than it's our fault. It's the U.S. fault, and we created the problem, and now we're paying a price for our stupidity of the past. But in the near term, this has a real potential to blow up on us one way or another. And, as the father of two draft-age sons, I hate this kind of thing. It terrifies me to think that my kids might be sucked into some, incomprehensible nightmare in some horrible place far, far away that they had nothing to do with, and that their, living or dying over there won't make a bit of difference. So I'm terrified of something like this. And from a financial standpoint, this is also very scary because... Oh, go ahead, Jim, sorry.
I was going to say, but what about the money implications? The U.S. technically is bankrupt because of all the money spent on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You get physically involved in Syria. Could the U.S. economy even deal with a conflict like that?
Well, that's the thing. We're emotionally and financially exhausted as a society. You know, we've been mixed up in the Middle East forever, you know, for the entire adult lives of most people. And we've been borrowing huge amounts of money year after year after year during that same time. So we really don't have the resources that we think we do, or that we remember having from 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. So for us to get involved in Syria and actually, you know, pacify that part of the Middle East would take another few $1 trillion, just like Iran took, or Iraq took. And that's assuming we can do it. And at the same time, it'll take thousands of American lives. You know, this won't be an air war if we went in there and tried to straighten everything out. This would be a ground war in which a lot of our guys get killed. So we're completely unprepared for that. You know, it doesn't matter who's in charge right now. It doesn't matter whether it's Barack Obama or Jeb Bush next time around, or even, you know, Donald Trump or somebody like that. As a country, we are not ready for something like this. And yet, we could get sucked into it. You know, that's what happens when you're an empire that's been stretched to its limit. You bump up against the choice of giving up your empire, you know, and retrenching, which is a huge blow to your ego when you think you're the most powerful entity on the planet, or taking this mad gamble of throwing even more good money after bad money when you really don't have much left. And the price of failure is the forcible dissolution of your empire. You know, and that's where we are now. We're where Rome was in AD 300, and where the British Empire was after World Wars I and II. You know, we're faced with this point in time when we've basically used up all the resources that we have to maintain something that is unsustainable. And so the question is, how do we lose our empire? Is it taken away from us, or do we voluntarily give it up and kind of retrench and lick our wounds and then come back stronger, hopefully, in decades hence, you know? And I don't know if we are going to be able to make the right choices here. I hope we do, which would be the British model of basically giving up the unsustainable parts of the empire. In other words, calling our soldiers home, closing military bases, cutting the military budget, cutting the entitlement budget, and getting our finances back in order to avoid the financial crisis that'll come simultaneously with a global military crisis if we don't scale back. You know, if we don't get it together, the market will impose stability on us at a very high cost. And that's what we've got to deal with right now. And it's not clear that we're emotionally ready for that, and that terrifies me.
Well, a lot of people take the position, too. It's time that somebody else started risking their people to stop terrorist groups like ISIS instead of always calling on Canada, the U.S., and Britain to do it.
Yeah. The problem is we cause these groups. You know, we create ISIS and Al-Qaeda and to an extent, the Taliban. You know, we were there at the inception of these groups, and in a lot of cases, we funded them and armed them, and we created the environment in which that kind of an ideology can thrive. So, you know, I think that we deserve to pay a price for having created these guys. But yeah, you know, if there is going to be stability in the world in the future, then it's got to be the guys in the region, the reasonable people in the region who impose stability on their own backyard. In other words, Europe has got to handle Europe, and Japan and China have got to handle Asia, and Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Israel and whoever else we think of as reasonable in the Middle East. They've got to set up their own system over there and impose order. Or, you know, the Middle East has to have its reformation. In other words, it has to have a period that might be very bloody, but is necessary, in which they figure out how they want religion and government to coexist. Will they have a theocracy across the Islamic world? Or will they have constitutional monarchies and elected democratic governments that are supreme over the local religion? And, you know, it took Europe several hundred years and an awful lot of bloodshed to figure out that they wanted liberal democracy, basically. And the Islamic world has to go through that process before they have a coherent personality, you know? And we should probably just step back and let them do it, which means, a nightmare century in the Middle East, but an unavoidable one.
And if we let them duke it out, would that stop the immigration crisis? Probably not. Huh?
Very probably not, because there would probably right now, if you just turned the Sunnis and the Shiites loose by pulling the U.S. influence out of the Middle East, you would get one of two things. You either get a civil war between those groups with, ISIS versus Iran, basically, with everybody else lining up on one side or the other. And that would be incredibly messy. But in the end, one side would win, and you would have an Islamic world with a definable personality that would allow you to analyze them and try to work with them. Or you'd get other powers moving into that vacuum and taking over. And that's kind of what's happening right now. The U.S. has kind of pulled back and is dithering on the sidelines in the Middle East, and Russia and China and Iran now are stepping in and saying, well, okay, we'll take this if you don't want it. And so that's also very possible. But, it could be that just becomes their headache then, because they still, even if they take over the Middle East, they're inheriting something that is inherently unstable. And so it's not clear that Russia would do a better job of dominating the Middle East than the U.S. would. So, it could be.
Well, local people never like somebody else telling them what to do. That's the entire history of the world.
That's the way of the world. You've got imperialist powers doing stuff like this since the beginning of time. And Russia isn't really over its imperialist impulses. It would like to control the Middle East. And China isn't really that externally aggressive, but they would definitely like the resources there because they're an incredibly resource-hungry country. So there are reasons and attractions from the point of view of Russia and China for allying themselves with Iran and setting up some kind of a one-region government there. But again, this is also crazy now because you've got 4 or 5 different possibilities for the way this could go. And it's not clear if there's any best case scenario, it's not clear which one it is. And there's a whole lot of worst case scenarios. And so much of this depends on the decisions of people sitting around conference tables under extreme levels of pressure, operating with very, very insufficient information, making these decisions. And so there's no way to know how this shakes out. It's just potentially incredibly dangerous. And from a financial standpoint, this could destabilize the global financial system very easily because if the U.S. is seen to be impotent in an incredibly important part of the world, what does that do to the dollar? Does that help the dollar or hurt the dollar? It's not clear. It could be that if we pull back and the world starts to spin out of control in the absence of U.S. Military dominance, then that might make dollars actually more attractive because more capital will flee the crazy parts of the world that we're no longer stabilizing and want to be in treasury bonds. Or, it could make the U.S. look economically weak as well as militarily weak, and it could be that the dollar is no longer the only reserve currency out there. Maybe people see that Russia and China are in the ascendancy and they want to start holding rubles and yuan. I don't know. When things start spinning out of control, all you get is scenarios. You don't get one clear path from here to some definable future. And that's where we are now. We're on the brink of financial chaos. Even, leaving the Middle East insanity out of the equation, we would still have a gigantic financial crisis coming just because we borrowed so much money. But you throw in a very important and very unstable part of the world blowing up, and you get the potential for all kinds of things that will probably be bad. It's hard to see how you have a happy ending to any of the individual situations in the world. Japan's finances, you can't fix them. Europe's demographic issues and the fatal flaw of the euro and the Syrian refugee problem happening all at once. You can't make a happy cake out of that mix of broken eggs and spilled flour and stuff like that. You can't turn that into a happy situation 2 years hence. So I would say there's a really good chance of an extremely messy world in 2016 in which all the major central banks have no choice but to go back to QE. In other words, we've got to liquefy the world to smooth a lot of this stuff over in the hope that, maybe you can paper over some of these crises by giving lots of people lots of money. And that's going to be their only hope. But of course that brings with it the risks of financial instability as too much fiat currency starts sloshing around in the world and causing bubbles and busts and various kinds of instability and various kinds of malinvestment and excessive risk taking and excessive risk aversion. It'll just cause a lot of crazy things that will be in some cases mutually contradictory and in some cases mutually reinforcing. And again, no way to know how this plays out, Jim. It's going to be crazy, but we can't know the details because there are just too many moving parts.
We'll have more with John Rubino right after the break.
More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600.
Welcome back. We're speaking with John Rubino. John, a warning that junk bonds might start to default, and a lot of people hold those.
Yeah. In times of easy credit, junk bonds tend to do very well because weak companies are able to refinance their debt and avoid any kind of crisis, any kind of perception that they might default because they got plenty of new cash from that recent debt offering, But when money tightens up a little bit, junk bonds are one of the first sectors that blows up because these companies, as soon as they can't refinance, start to run out of money. And that's what's happening in the junk bond world right now because you had a huge amount of money, hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars, depending on the measure that you use, for instance, were borrowed by the kind of new age energy companies that were fracking and pulling oil out of tar sands and things like that. These expensive kinds of energy that are now no longer economic with oil at $50 US per barrel. So that section of the junk bond market is in very deep trouble. And then, meanwhile, you've got all kinds of leveraged debt that is being taken on by, less risky corporations, but they're leveraging themselves to the point where they're liable to be junk bonds pretty soon. They're liable to be sucked into a wave of defaults going forward. And you've got auto loans in the U.S., which are basically the newest kind of subprime debt, being repackaged into asset-backed bonds and sold to institutions around the world. And a lot of those things are going to blow up pretty soon. So, yeah, the junk bond market is a time bomb. And that's another thing that the world's central banks are going to try to paper over with easy money in the next couple of years. They're going to push interest rates down to negative levels, and they're going to make it very, very easy, if they can, if the markets allow them to do this. They will make it very easy for virtually anybody to borrow money in the hopes that all of these crappy companies with tons of junk debt will be able to refinance for 5 years or 10 years at rates that aren't onerous and that allow them to survive for a little while longer to get them through the potential crisis. Of course, all that does is build a bigger time bomb for 2 or 3 years from now, when this even larger overhang of unserviceable debt starts to blow up later, then the crisis will be even bigger. And that's what we've been doing for the last 30 years. We've been delaying or avoiding a crisis in the moment at the cost of an even bigger crisis in the future. And so that's why things are so scary right now, because we've piled so much debt onto so many different entities that can never come close to paying that debt off in the interest of getting through the next election cycle or the next quarterly earnings report or the next cycle for the renomination of the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Those have been our time targets. And we've met them by and large. We've kept the world from falling apart, but in the meantime, debt has gone up and up and up, and the amount of unserviceable debt has soared. So somebody, sometime, is going to blow up and take the rest of the system down with them. And we can't know whether it'll be Japan or China or Europe spinning out of control and the Eurozone breaking apart, or the U.S. having some kind of a political, military, financial crisis that sends the dollar plunging. You can't know what's going to happen. But somebody's going to blow up, and then everybody else is going to be extremely vulnerable to the fallout from that crisis. And, right now, like you said, junk bonds look like the immediately best candidate, but it could really be all kinds of things. It could be like we talked about the Middle East, turning into some kind of a crisis that affects the rest of the world. It could be the Eurozone just finally collapsing under its own weight. It could be anything in 2016. I think the only thing we can say with certainty is that all the central banks of the world are going to respond to these crises with easier money. And that will probably be the big financial story, is the next stage of experimental monetary policy, where we decide to try negative interest rates across the board, and we impose capital controls in order to stop the destabilizing flow of funds that naturally come from negative interest rates. And we try to make cash illegal, because you can't really have negative interest rates if people can just go to all cash, where they don't have to pay negative interest rates to keep their money in the bank. So we're going to see a lot of things that are experimental / crazy in the next couple of years, and they're going to be a response to the fact that we've caused so many problems by kicking the can down the road in years past.
John, thanks a lot for chatting with us.
Sure thing, Jim.
My guest has been John Rubino, author of several books on the economy, including The Money Bubble, his website, dollarcollapse.com. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Check out our popular YouTube channel, Talk Digital Network. Comments about the show can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.